Okay, I'll go ahead and start. My name is Darold Higa, and I'm a narrative designer at Wargaming Chicago, Baltimore, primarily working on the World of Tanks franchise. But today's topic is about user-generated content, and this is something I'm passionate about, and I think I have to go over a reason why I'd be passionate about it. But first, let's start. What is the whole idea of user-generated content? And basically, user-generated content, I think, came into fashion a couple of years ago and then promptly became unfashionable. And I think that there's a very good reason for this. It's because it used a very constrained definition of what we consider to be user-generated content. And what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a taxonomy for understanding user-generated content that expands its definition. Now, I think since that time, people are actually talking about user-generated content, but we're not calling it as such. So what I'm trying to do is unify all of the ideas of what are disparate things that we're calling, that we associate with our users or our player base, but not necessarily thinking of them holistically. And so this is sort of just to promote this. Now, there's no one magic bullet, or this is not something that I can just point to as implemented in a game, but I feel like this is actually a very important glue. And in a competitive market, entertainment market that we live in, that this is actually essential moving forward in the future. And I'll explain why I think so. So the next thing is, how is it encouraged? How is it supported and encouraged? So I think that the other thing to consider here is that this is a very organic process, and a lot of things that I'm going to talk about are actually not about your game, which is kind of counterintuitive. But what I'm trying to get at here is that when you are making your game, if you think of your game in a very strict context of I'm in console, so a player sitting on his couch with the controller in his hand, his or her hand, you're missing a large degree of what a player interacts with your game. And that is the scope that I'm saying is not necessarily systemically built into how we build our games, but that we keep that in mind when we're designing them. And finally, why does it matter? Look, most of the time, we're just happy that when a player hits the control button, that it actually moves properly, or that they have the proper game mechanics, or that everything shows up and renders properly, and that people bought it, or that it reviews well. But what I suggest is that's only the first step. That if you can engage your user community in different ways, that you will actually turn what is just a successful game or a successful gameplay mechanic into an actual intellectual property or an IP. Okay, so how did I get here? So it's an interesting thing because I worked at a bunch of different studios. The previous studio that I worked at, I had the great opportunity that it was a virtual studio. Like initially, we said, oh, okay, we're going to be a virtual studio for about 6 months while we finish all the logistics for putting together our physical studio. So I said, okay, that's fine. Is it okay if I relocate as long as I keep the same hours? And they're like, okay, that's fine. It doesn't matter. As long as you have internet, we're doing everything virtually. So I took the opportunity to kind of live out a lifelong fantasy, and I moved to Tokyo. And it's funny because actually getting a job in Tokyo in the game industry is actually quite difficult. But because I was already working for a virtual studio, I kind of got the best of both worlds. So I was able to sort of live my life there. And what I discovered was not necessarily anything that I would have discovered professionally. But what I discovered hanging out at all the conventions over the weekends and everything else was that there's a huge and undocumented culture that we're talking about. In fact, it's really funny because I gave an extensive interview in IGN to one of the Asia Pacific authors, and I was talking about some of this stuff. He goes, "Oh, I haven't heard of any of that. This is a guy who lives in Australia, has very easy access to the Japan market, and hadn't seen any of this." And what it is that it's komike and dojinshi, and I think people associate komike and dojinshi primarily with anime. But what's interesting is it really is far beyond that, and it's an entire ecosystem of stuff that honestly never leaves the country. It's starting to, okay? Like, for example, if you've heard of a game called Reciteer, that actually started off as a komike game and eventually, found its way to Steam. But really what it is that this is the whole world of self-publishing. And the interesting thing is, if you think about it, komike, if you don't know anything, if you haven't heard about it, is basically a sort of comic market. It's about 40 years old. It has, it's twice a year, and it has over 600,000 attendees. So let's think about that now. Our biggest sort of pop culture, San Diego Comic-Con, that's 135,000 people, right? This is about 500,000 people. And now the Japanese use a different counting system. So basically, people are coming every day, and they don't necessarily have sustained. You can't actually keep track of your attendees. People just show up. There's all the mass transit systems, everything else are just designed to get people in and out of that area for that short period of time. They do it twice a year. What's incredible is, and people don't realize this, is that there are 30,000 vendors there. And what those vendors are, they're not companies, they're circles. And what circles are basically groups of fans that have gone together and made their own stuff, okay? And in America, honestly, when you hear about doujinshi, there's often an adult connotation to it. That's only a fraction of the stuff. What I was amazed when I was walking around just kind of discovering stuff is, there are whole sections of games that are just being developed, things like Reciteer, right? And the amazing thing about that is, if you even talk to people in the industry, at the same year that I went to one of the Comic and saw all of these video games, and I bought a bunch of them, they're really cool. I went to Tokyo Game Show, and they have this thing called Sense of Wonder Night, and they're saying, oh, we're bringing in all these, independent game makers from around the world because there's no indie gaming in Japan. And I'm like, in your own country, there are like thousands of clubs making these, micro games. None of them are really big, but they're making all these games and selling, buying and selling them to each other. So it got me thinking. This was sort of a big breakthrough for me in terms of understanding user-generated content, because I started realizing that as somebody who makes IP, and that if you make a game, if you make characters, if you make scenarios, you're actually generating an environment where people will take what you love or what you created out of your love, and they love it too. And they have to express that love in different ways. And this is what I'm talking about. This is why I'm saying we need a more holistic view of user-generated content. I mean, when you talked about user-generated content 5 years ago, and I used to talk about pretty much the same thing, everyone's like, oh yeah, a map editor. And I'm like, no, not a map editor, everything. And they're like, what do you mean by everything? So it's time for us to start defining our terms. So first of all, what are fanatics? And these are basically the users of our game, right? So these are people who play the game, and that's your basic, when you talk about user-generated content. And in all honesty, okay, if you're in a boardroom and you're talking about game design, this is what everyone is thinking about when we talk about users. The interesting thing is that when you communicate to a user, though, you're not just communicating to the user, you're communicating to everyone else that user interacts with, right? If you're able to touch them. So that's kind of the big caveat here. But that's why I'm saying we need to think of this holistically, right? Because if you are able to touch an individual user who's playing your game, if that experience is imprinted on them in any way, if they have a love for it in any way, it will go beyond that, right? This is social networking. It's really funny because everyone goes, oh, you're just talking about social networking and sharing and all of this stuff. Yes, but if you don't think of that as user-generated content, you think of that as something separate, then you go, oh, well, we'll have our customer community team handle it, or we'll have our customer service team handle it. No, it's your product. It's part of your product. It's part of your IP. That is actually what you're fostering, right? So defining your terms, you can tell I was at one point a college professor and decided that was not a lucrative career and went into gaming, which is even less of a lucrative career, but that's sort of the path that I took. What I start off here is this is not really a true taxonomy, but I'm just trying to get at trying to explain or have terms for things that we refer to very vague, in very vague terms. So in-game is pretty obvious. It's anything actually interacting with the game. Extra game is obviously the real world outside of that game. And we use terms like metagame very loosely, but what I'm suggesting here, at least for the purposes of this definition, not necessarily a general definition, is that what we're really talking about when we talk about metagame is things about the game that are not in the game itself. So like if I'm talking about the game universe, if I'm talking about game characters, those are sort of metagame elements, okay? Because now you've created enough of a world, or you've created enough of a universe, or even enough of a scenario where people are thinking about your characters. I mean, even if it's, I hate to say it, even if someone draws an adult version of your character, I mean, they're still carrying that character forward, right? They have an idea about it. And then what I suggest is a sort of a really cop-out term, but metagame is when people actually talk about their game experiences, right? And I try to distinguish it between these two because I think right now we see these as independent things. But what I'm saying is that they're actually part, the reason why I'm trying to use these terms to kind of create a macro structure for that is that what I'm saying is that we really do need to conceive of them as parts of a continuum or parts of a whole. So what do we think about when we think about in-game user created content? And so, this is things that I think are pretty obvious, and I think initially this is where most of the focus was, because all we were really thinking about is how a player interacts with our game. And not to trivialize this, right? This is already a big challenge. But, but we don't usually consider it to be content, right? So for instance, if I have two players chatting in my game, that's content. I've somehow created a context and environment for them to interact. Now, it could be sending a smiley icon. It could be telling them to, beep off. It doesn't matter, right? You've created a context for interaction, and that's content. And that's actually something that they've created in the framework of your game, right? Game modification and game levels, again, the level editor stuff. I think that that's orthodox and that's understood, right? In-game shared content is a little bit trickier. It's like when you, for instance, like there's some RPGs out there. There's a Korean RPG called Mabinogi, and what people used to do there is that because they would create, you could buy a script and you could create music, and then what they would do is that they would create music and then they would be playing it in game, and then other players who are in that immediate vicinity would actually hear them, and then people started actually having concerts and performances virtually because of that, right? So you're giving people tools to generate these kind of things. And then the other thing too is, and this is where we talk about in-game and extra game, and so what I'm saying is that this is extra game sharing of in-game content, so screen caps and things like that. And I think that that's also something to keep in mind. And we tend to think of these as independent systems, and that's really, I guess, what is I'm going to keep coming back to during this discussion is that, oh, there's this and there's this and there's this. We're going to try to gap, virality. Everyone talks about that and everything else, but we don't see this as a whole, right? Your content is just as related to the virality of a game as if you have a Facebook share option, right? Like there's lots of different elements in the game, and thinking of them as individual systems defeats the whole point of understanding that this is all about understanding and capturing the passion of your players for your game. Oh, by the way, all my pictures, I tend to pick fan art and things like that, just to make that point that this is all content created by the user community. We also have some, sort of metagame user content. So this is like, these are things that people do with the existing universe or universe that you've created or narrative you've created or characters that you've created, right? They'll put it in new venues, right? Or new platforms. They'll talk about, when I say like using the existing game engine to create new gameplay or narrative, that's obviously like building new and interesting stories that are in the context of your game, right? And then obviously this was a big fad a while ago. I think it's kind of died off, but it's the idea of using a game engine to create basically a non-game related, like a machinima kind of like cinematics or things like that. And that's also interesting. And basically extending the game narrative, and this sounds very formal, but this is fanfic, right? I mean, but fanfic, but if you have your community writing fanfic, you've done something right, because you've now engaged them in such a way that they care enough about this universe. Even if it's a simple Mary Sue and they're putting themselves in the universe, you've engaged them enough to do this. And we tend to think of this is outside. Okay, well, I'm a game developer. I'm not even going to worry about that. But actually, if you're worrying about that, if you're thinking about that, then you're basically fostering the ability for this to happen. Creating derivative games. And this is something that I said, like I said, this was one of those breakthroughs, because when I was in Japan, what I saw in those doujinshi markets was that people would take an existing game and make new or derivative games from it. And a classic example is this game called Toho, and it's one of these, it's basically a bullet hell, so where the screen is filled with bullets and you have to dodge it and you have to shoot a target. The guy who worked on that was really, really brilliant. He's an indie developer, single guy. He did his own music, he did his own art, he did his own stories, and he did his own programming. And he basically became the master of this bullet time game. But his stroke of genius is that instead of it being like spaceships shooting other spaceships or aliens or stuff like that, these were characters and they were casting magic at each other. These were just big battles. And there was a story related to all of this. He told the fan community, you know what? Okay, I make the bullet time games. My characters belong to the community. And at that point, an interesting thing happened at Comic-Con. It used to be that Comic-Con was whatever interesting animation, manga, or games that were popular at that time would be the thing that would be parodied. There was at one point a time when the Comic-Con staff was plotting a graph saying what percentage of Comic-Con was going to be Toho. And they said, oh wow, by 2020, it will just be a Toho show. Because the adoption, because of the fact that they created an environment where users felt comfortable calling the characters their own, they ran wild with it. Not only did they just create fan art, which we expect, or fan fiction, they started creating whole games, fighting games, other types of shooters that weren't necessarily bullet time. And that was all okay, because as long as it wasn't bullet hell, he was okay with it. And so that's because of that, his franchise has been extremely successful. It has actually been commercialized in many ways. And he did that by opening it up to the community. Now, there's a catch to that, right? So Japan has a different legal mechanism for handling things like intellectual property. And the one big difference you see here is that, ironically, they have a much stronger IP protection. So in other words, the one clause that you find in America that is probably limiting in this is the idea of enforcement or non-enforcement. So if you do not enforce or protect your copyright, you waive it here. That is not the case in Japan, that you can always enforce your copyright. So that thing that sounds like it's actually being more strict allows Japanese companies to turn the other eye. So when I'm talking about this Comic-Con that happens twice a year with 30,000 people selling to 600,000 people, these are no longer trivial numbers, okay? What happens is that the companies turn a blind eye to the copyright violations. And there's actually shows where they sell merchandise. They'll sell figures of characters that are otherwise copyright protected, but it's waived on that one day for that one event. And what this does is that it makes your title extremely popular. And of course, I should finish this first. There are other things too when you talk about metagame user-generated content. Things like homage and parody, cosplay, doujinshi, and figures and 3D models. What I'm actually showing you here, if you're familiar with Gundam, that's actually not a plastic model. This is actually made by fans. That's actually paper. So and they'll sell you a couple pieces of paper that have all the markings on it. You cut it out and you put it together, and that's not a piece of plastic. That's just paper that's put together, and it's a kit. And they can sell it right next to the Bandai booth during this event only, right? They can't sell it outside of that. But then because of this, it encourages people. And it's like, you might be interested in a plastic model. When you see that's made out of paper, you're like, oh, wow, I'm really kind of curious about that, right? And this is how, so people who are not even engaged in your franchise are all of a sudden like, oh, what is this thing? This is really cool, right? And then, so in other words, what we really want to do is to inspire our users to become creators. Creators in any sense, right? That's why I want to use this broader definition of user-generated content, right? Because by doing that, you're basically giving your users a sense of ownership, right? And then you're basically creating something that's rich. So the expectation and the anticipation on the game designer is to create something rich enough so that people can actually riff on it, right? If there's nothing there, it's going to be very difficult for them to copy it. And you might say, well, what implications does this really have for a game developer? Or let's say I'm not a AAA developer. I don't have time to develop this huge lore or lots of characters or really deep stories. Hey, do you have a backstory for all your characters? Are your characters all, basically, contrivance, or do they actually have some story? If you have a story, keep that in mind. Not only is that something where you can, drop hints about it when you're talking. So let's say that you get a press interview about what you're working on, right? And you could say, well, blah, 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 is a whole backstory. And then you can even leave it at that, right? And all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, these characters really have a backstory? Even if you don't have the ability to implement in the game, having these things ready creates the fodder for your fan community to feed on, right? The last thing, and this of course, the last thing of course is to actually give users the tools and outlets for expression. So this does require actual commitment of code and resources and everything else. But honestly, I think that this is something that, because we start talking about virality and everything else, people think of this as separate systems. But this should be this is actually part of your IP, actually, right? And this is actually part about fostering your intellectual property. So what's the bottom line? You know, normally this is a longer presentation, so I'm kind of jumping through things, so you have to pardon me. But the bottom basically is that as content creators, and we know this, right? Like a 5-minute meeting for an idea then takes 6 months to a year or 2 or 3 years to implement, right? So our rate of implementation is extremely limited. And we also, especially if we're in a formal studio environment, there is only a certain rate at which we can actually produce content, right? So the problem is we may trigger people's imaginations about something or about a universe or about a place or about characters, but we can't generate content fast enough to fulfill their appetite. So there's two options at that point, right? Let that appetite starve out or feed it. And how does it get fed? It can actually be fed by your user community if they're set up to do so, right? They definitely want to consume more than you can create. I mean, that's the honest truth, right? I mean, I work in the free-to-play industry, so perfect example, right? Like, I mean, there is so much out there to consume, right? And what we are trying to do is get people's mind share. So we need people to want to always be consuming our, you know, basically consuming our content, because there's a lot of competition out there. And if people take the time to write about it, even to blog about it, to stream about it, even to necessarily just say, you know, I like this game, but there are problems with it. Anything, not necessarily just creating fanfic, but talking about your game with your friends, why they like it, why they don't like it, expands this realm and increases engagement in your product, right? And then I think that this is also, you know, and like I said, because of the supply and demand, because we cannot provide them enough stuff in time, it keeps it in their mind all the time. And then basically what this does is it becomes the outlet for your fanatics to channel their passion, right? If they have no place to channel their passion, they'll find the next game to channel into, right? So if we want to keep them engaged, if we, so like I work in a game service, so you get, well, gee, of course, obviously for you guys want to keep your people engaged in your game. Well, if you're trying to build an IP, maybe this is not just going to be one game. Maybe it's going to be a series of games. Maybe it's episodic content. Maybe it's DLC. In any case, you're going to want to set up a pipeline where there's an anticipation for more, or even just followers of your studio, right? You know, however you want to do this, or as an individual designer, right? You want to build an audience. And basically, the best part about this is the virality part. And I think, you know, because of the explosion of social media, we all understand this part, is that if other people get excited about this product or this content, they will engage others to do the same. My classic example, this is another one of these things where it's not well documented in the US, but it's a clear example of this, is a game called Kankole, or Kantai Collection, which is Fleet Collection. And it's a Japanese web-based game. And okay, the premise itself is already weird because it's anthropomorphized World War II warships. So, okay, already it's a kind of a weird niche game. But the interesting thing about it, and then the thing that was fascinating about it, I don't think I ever would have heard about it if it weren't for the fact that the mechanics are really great. Okay, so the mechanics actually in the gameplay are extremely complex and nuanced, but you never would have known about it just hearing about the premise or anything else like that. And so what ended up happening was a rather famous comic artist played it, really liked it, and drew a picture of one of the characters. And what happened is that other artists was like, oh, that's a really cool picture. And other artists started drawing, looking at the game and drawing other pictures of these characters and everything else, and it exploded. And now that game, which is basically a simple web-based game, they did not build it for scalable architecture. They had to put their game on a lottery system just to get an account. They have now spawned a television show, a movie show, derivative games, an arcade game, and more merchandising than you can shake a stick at. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of figures and other properties. They have events at amusement parks. They have all these other things, all based on that. And the truth is, what built that game and what built that marketing for that game had no marketing budget. was the fact that the community became engaged in it and amplified it. Now, that's not going to happen in every case, but it's interesting enough that to think about it in terms of when you're designing the content. So anyway, I think I'm already kind of getting close to the end here, but and I apologize, I went through that really fast because the half-an-hour format is a bit, just when you're getting to a good part, you got to kind of stop. But does anyone have any questions or comments or anything? Oh, yes.
So I know you talked about the difference between Japan and the United States and the IP laws associated with that. So especially coming from a company that I'm assuming is trying to do a lot of stuff you're talking about, build that audience. How do you balance the need between being able to protect your copyright and also sharing as much as you can?
So this is one of those weird things. I'm at Wargaming, so we have the advantage and disadvantage that our IP is history. So in our case, our core audience are historically minded. So when I talk about an M4 Sherman or an IS-2 tank or something like that, or an IL-2 Sturmovik, or some aircraft or a German tank like a Panzer IV, that's kind of, there's no need to worry about protection and everything else. But I think what ends up mattering is building up lore around it that matters, right? So like for instance, and this is something that I've been personally associated with, one thing that I was always concerned about with our company is that there was no way for people to actually get connected to the stories of the characters. So I worked on something called War Stories, where we basically started telling alternative history. Like one of our scenarios is basically, well, what if Germany really did invade England? So now you have to play the British pushing the Germans back from London back to the shores to do a reverse Dunkirk. Or another one I did is that, Kennedy actually, instead of establishing the blockade, decides to invade Cuba. And you're a tank commander stuck in all of that. So the interesting thing about that is that although these are not necessarily things that are protectable, what we've done is we've told stories with our characters and our scenarios that engage kind of an element of storytelling and creating a narrative that might not have been there before. And we've actually gotten a lot of response for it. I mean, it's not something that easily translates into, let's say, something that's monetized, because we actually give it away for free. But it's one of those things where it gets people's imaginations going and it gets people talking about the product, and it re-energizes your community who otherwise are paying a multiplayer game that has no lore. So it's funny because I'm talking from a company that actually has very little characters, because what I say is that our characters are these historical characters, so there's very little you can do with them. But what I argue is that even in that sense, because that's what Concolay was too, because Kantai Collection was about these World War II ships, but they anthropomorphized them, right? So instead of it being a warship, it was a female dressed up in outfits that reflected the history of that ship, okay? And it sounds really weird. I know it's really weird, but I've been playing it for like 3 years. But the interesting thing about that is that for every one of these ships, they inherit a whole story, and the community goes crazy over that. Because now, by anthropomorphizing it, they actually gave them a channel for this to happen. Now, specifically in the US, I think this is a challenge because you have this idea of enforcement. So I don't think you can go as far as openly promoting fan fiction, right? But if you have forums, if you have places where you can engage your fans, you definitely don't discourage it, right? If there are ways to have them do user-generated content, that's great. If there are ways to engage your user within the game design, that's even better, right? Like for a game like us, one of our big user-generated content is really war stories. Like people telling war stories after the fact. Not the project I worked on, but like I was in this battle where I did X, Y, Z, and people will talk about it years later. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is there any other questions, comments? Because I think, we're out of time. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.